Good evening, everyone, and welcome again as we continue along with our wealth management discussions. Um, we've gone through more than half the content. We've covered the financial services sector, industry regulation, asset classes, collective investments, and you've also gone through economics and statistics as well. So essentially, quick look at what remains is fiduciary relationships, which is what we are going to start today, which really reiterates our position as financial advisors. We will look more into investment analysis and what it involves. We will then ultimately go across into investment management, which brings across all that initial day one discussion, the introduction which we had to the investment and wealth management process on a more formal basis. We bring it all together through investment management, and we will finish off with lifetime financial provisioning, which is as it applies to individuals. Right? So let's jump into fiduciary relationships then. So what we are after here is to recognize the fiduciary responsibilities that arise and the main duties and responsibilities of financial advisors, because ultimately there is a very simple equation here. You as a financial advisor, me as a financial advisor, or board of directors even for that matter, we are all governed by this fiduciary duty, where we must take into consideration these duties to our clients, right? And it's an important part of the financial management process as well, because in a more practical context, if you do look at it, there are more than enough instances out there. I'm sure you don't have to look far, where ultimately the financial advisor is making a lot of money, he is growing, but the clients unfortunately are not having any such benefits. Right now, that is not a good thing, right? Which is where all this regulation and governance and even the fiduciary relationships also come into play. So what are we talking about when it comes to fiduciary relationships is one in which a person places a special trust as investment advisors, as financial advisors. Our clients come to us with their portfolios, for example, putting us in a place of extra trust, confidence, and reliance, and is influenced by another who has a fiduciary duty to act for the benefit of that person as well. And that is us on this side of the equation. And then you have the clients who is on the other side of the equation, who places that extra trust for you to manage your portfolios. And don't forget, particularly when you look at the likes of equity markets, when you look at derivatives, etc., in the asset classes, we identified that you can even lose the principal or the capital portion of the client's monies as well, of the client's portfolios, right? It's not like placing the monies across into a fixed deposit or a money market instrument, for instance, or even property for that matter. The chances that you can erode the capital proportion significantly is very high in certain asset classes like equity and derivative instruments. Right? And obviously the clients are putting that trust in you not to let that happen, and of course generate a return for them as well. So you have the client and you have ourselves, which is the financial advisor, acting, who must act in the best interest of that client. So some of the fundamental principles behind how these fiduciary relationships are going to be based on will include the likes of openness, fairness, integrity, etc. will be key elements of these duties in maintaining this relationship across. And this will understandably relate to the likes of your agency theory, where you have this agent principal relationship, director shareholders, lawyer client, doctor client privileges, etc. Particularly as it applies to us, we are talking about this agent principal relationship, which comes from a even an age old issue. You have the principals who are the owners of the business, and you have the agents, those who are running the business. You take any listed company, there is a bit, there is some overlap, yes, but there is a notable disconnect between those who own the company and those who operate the company, who run the business, right? And there will be some overlap because directors also might own shares. Now, one person is putting the money and taking all the risk, and another set of individuals is completely running the business. Right? So the risk, return, rewards, etc. can get skewed because of this disconnect, which is where this agency theory comes into place. Essentially, you talk about this agent and the principal. Principal being the shareholders, agent being the board of directors. The agents who are appointed by the principals must operate in a way where they are meeting the requirements, objectives, etc. of the principals. Right? Very important in our context as well, since our clients place that level of trust, confidence, and reliance on us to manage their portfolios. The responsibilities that a regulated financial advisor must follow will include the likes of good faith, acting in good faith for your client. Look, as financial advisors, it's very difficult. I mean, I would even venture to say impossible to give a guarantee, right? I mean, unless you're going to put your money in a fixed deposit and you can confirm a particular level of return, any other asset classes when you're talking about, if you're trying to guarantee a level of return over, I mean, even for fixed deposits, if you put it for a longer period of time, are you able to guarantee with certainty that you are going to give that level of return? Difficult. Right? What is expected out of the financial advisors is to act in good faith. And there's a ton of decisions that you will have to be making. Which are the asset classes? How much of percentages are going to allocate? Are you going to look at a passive or an active investment strategy? All of these considerations which we have discussed will come into play. And us as the financial advisors, should have had an interaction with the client, recognize his risk return objectives, and we should have, with reasonable competency, establish that, for example, portfolio which is suitable to the client. Now we are acting in good faith. Things can happen. Who would have foreseen a pandemic? Who would have foreseen the tsunami? Who would have foreseen you could have foreseen a subprime mortgage in the US, but these unforeseen events is difficult to control. So we can't give a guarantee, but as long as you acted in good faith, that is the expectation of your fiduciary duty. And of course, you have to be able to prove that you have acted in good faith as well, which is where the likes of that investment policy statement, for example, which we spoke in day one, comes into play. Not make a profit from the trust placed in him. Now, particularly when you're talking about institutional clients, for example, you can do certain unethical trading practices like front running, for instance. Your client, who is a high net worth individual or a institutional investor, has a significant number of shares in the market in a particular stock, and he wants to liquidate this position, or let's say he's looking to invest into a particular company in a pretty big way. He's looking to take over a particular company. Now you got inside information there. You can front run, meaning before the client makes the purchase, you can go ahead and make certain purchases as well on the same counter. The moment your client executes the transaction, because of the level of demand, the prices are going to go up. What is going to happen to your investment which you unethically purchased? You're going to make a profit as well. This is not good. This is not good. Because, for example, even if you look at it in a different context, if you, to make a significant level of profit, buy into the shares notably, what is also going to happen as a result of your demand for the shares, the price is going to go up. A price at which the client could have purchased at 10 rupees because of your action, because you lobbied, because you got your friends and family to invest, etc. Hypothetically, that 10 rupee price moved up to about 11 rupees. But if the client is buying 100 million shares, as a result of that 1 rupee increase, he's going to lose. It's going to cost him 100 million rupees more. Right? You have made a profit at the expense of the client. Right? This too applies from a fiduciary relationship or duty perspective. You should not place yourself in a position where your own interests can conflict with the duty to the client. Right? Self-interest threat. You have to be careful. Right? This is why when it comes to financial advisors, when you look at our context, for example, we are part of research. My role is part of research in relation to equity markets. If we want to purchase shares, we will have to go through our company itself, the stockbroking company. We have to go through our company, meaning we'll have to pass through our compliance. It will have to get approved at a different level, and then only we can execute transactions. And not only that, if we are putting out a report, for example, there can be restrictions in us purchasing as research. Let's say, for example, I am going to put out a buy report on TJ Lanka PLC. Right? There may be, depending on the company and the level of compliance which we follow, there can be restrictions saying that any of the research employees cannot purchase their own recommendations. Right? These are all in the interest of clients, duties to clients, so that there isn't going to be any conflicts of interest. Our interest with that of the client does not come into conflict. Refrain from misusing confidential information. You can apply this to the same illustration we looked at a moment ago, where we were front running, for your own advantage or the benefit of a third person. Very important. You might not make use of that information, but you might pass it on to someone, your brother, your mother, your father, or friend, or whoever it might be. You might pass on the information, and that individual may act on it. Don't forget that can constitute to insider information as well. We looked at the different elements. What is insider information? What do we mean by materiality? What do we mean by price sensitive? What do we mean by an insider? And what do we mean by insider trading? All of those aspects relating to insider dealing, insider trading, and market abuse, basically, we spoke about as well. And this is exactly one of that. Inside information, material information has not been made public, price sensitive information you have come into contact with. You may not act on that information for your benefit, but you will act on that information by passing it on to someone to benefit from it. Is also construed as insider information as well, and obviously is against the duties to the clients and against the fiduciary duties which you are expected to abide by. Some of the key responsibilities, which are included in this client's best interest, is information disclosure and suitability. Very, very important aspect. Suitability we are going to constantly talk about as well. Right? And disclosures also is constantly used to disclose to the client what is our position, so that the client can also evaluate whether there is a conflict of interest in the position. Which is why most of the equity research reports, for example, carries the analyst's name as well. It will tell you whether there are certain conflicts, whether the analyst owns any shares, right? Whether it represents the company's views, whether it represents an individual's views, etc. All of this information, for example, are disclosed for the purpose of identifying whether there is any conflict of interest. If that is the case, you need to look at it from a compliance perspective as to whether there is any issues to duties of clients. Client's best interest. Let's look at it. Look at a bit of detail there. We are trying to identify the definition of what do we mean by client's best interest and the implication of this rule for a financial advisor. So a client's best interest is a fundamental rule for all investment advisors. Let me put this down so that's right. Because ultimately, your clients are giving you that level of funding and cash and other investments for you to manage it on their behalf. For them to earn a return, not for you to completely make a return. Like I mentioned, at the end of this investment process, if the only person that has benefited is the investment advisor, whereas all the clients have lost money, then there is some serious issue going on across over here. Which is why sometimes in equity markets, investment advisors come under a bit of fire. Because no matter if the market goes up, if the market goes down, as long as transactions are happening, a percentage as commissions is going to come to the broker. Very simple. But when you look at it from the client's perspective, he could have made money, lost money, made money, lost money. At the end of the day, he will be at a neutral, if not at a worse off position. Where does the broker stand? The broker has won on the deal. He bought from one client and sold to another client. He made a commission on this deal. He made a commission on this deal. Same transaction, two sides of the coin. Broker made money. But one client, between that deal, one client would have lost money. End of the day, clients are having a significant level of risk and a questionable level of return, but the broker has easily made his levels of commission. Right? So clients' best interest is fundamental. And if you think of it practical, I mean, considering we are looking at the banking sector, if you can really deliver on your client's expectations, what is going to happen? He's going to invest more money with you. He's going to the whole referral marketing thing will happen. You know, you will be able to network a lot better. That's why you need to be making your money, right? If not short-term gain, you are pursuing short-term gain at the expense of a long-term return. This can take many forms, client's best interest, right? Having sufficient information to advise clients. Now, this is super critical. We saw this in day one when I introduced you to the program, and we are constantly seeing this as well. If we cannot understand the circumstances of our clients, how in the world are we going to advise them is a major question mark. They can be risk-taking, they can be risk-averse, they can be risk-neutral. They can have short-term expectations. They can have long-term expectations. I mean, there is a huge level of information which we need to identify before we can actually advise them appropriately. If we don't gather that information, let's say, for example, you're talking about an individual who is in the banking sector, right? He works for a bank. He's in senior level management. He earns a significant amount of return from his employment, which over a period he has saved, and he has had some inheritance, which he has also parked in a fixed deposit, for example. Now he's coming to you for wealth advice. He says he wants to put a portion of his money in equity markets. And the investment advisor is saying, banks, this is the days, hypothetically, to put the money in the banks. We've got to look at the banking sector. That's the one which, it's the hot stocks these days. Now look at that advice. Individual is working in the bank. His salary is coming from the bank. His savings are in a fixed deposit in the banking sector. Now he wants to put some money in the capital markets. You're advising he puts his money in the banking stocks. Now all his eggs are in one basket, right? The level of risk that client is exposed because of the directions of the investment advisor, the client's level of risk is very high. Ideally, we would have had to start looking at a diversified option for him. Most of your wealth is concentrated in one industry. If one particular variable affecting the banking sector materializes, his entire portfolio is exposed. Whatever proportion he wants to put in equity markets, one of the first decisions would have been to advise, don't put it into banks. Let's diversify and look at something similar, if not close, in terms of return, but a completely different sector. Now you have diversified your risk. You maintain the levels of return at a lower level of risk. That is being efficient. If we didn't acquire this information, how will you be able to advise the client suitably? Right? Which is why we have a big issue in capital markets, for example. Clients call and ask the brokers, what do we put today? What is going today? What is going today? And we are advising, these are the hot stocks. These are the ones which are going. These are our research reports. But are we identifying, what are the exposures like? Is it appropriate? Is that level of investment? Is that level of risk appropriate for them? Unknown. Even the clients, all they want is return. You take the local context, a bulk of the retail investors, their focus is on return. Absolutely has nothing. No, I mean, they will never ask you about the risk. Almost never. What is the expectation on the stock going? 30% in 1 month's time. He will liquidate his house even and put it on a mortgage and try and invest in capital market. The risk about it, probability of it moving plus 30%, huge question mark. Right? and I may have brought this up previously as well, at a point of time in the recent past, there was a particular, actually a couple of counters which were making unbelievable waves in the market. Huge amount of transactions taking place, two particular counters, right? But you look at the financials, absolutely rubbish, negative profits, losses. But our retail investors were trading it so much, the prices were heavily inflated. How are you going to justify companies with no future, at least in the visible future, who have been constantly at a negative return? How are you going to justify entering into those stocks? If that is not manipulation, you seriously have to ask the question, what's going on, right? Selecting suitable investment is what we are talking about, and undertaking certain transactions. Again, the circumstances and the status of clients will give you an indication of whether they can undertake certain transactions. Do you want to put your money into the banking sector? Do you want to put this quantum of money into the banking sector? Do you want to go ahead with an active investment strategy where the cost might be high? Do you want to go with a passive investment strategy which requires you to have the ability to hold? Holding power has to be there. Buy and hold. We need to be able to recognize, based on the status and circumstances of the client, whether he has the ability to undertake certain transactions. Very, very critical, right? We will delve into more of this as we go along. So countries and regulators have taken numerous action to address the client's best interest, because don't forget, when you look at financial markets, the banks, the capital markets, the financial institutions, etc., all of these exchanges or intermediaries are in the middle, and you have the public's money coming in. Now, this is why regulatory oversight is required. If the banks raise finance through loan or equity or whatever, let's say for example, and they want to invest their own funds, entirely different story. If you're a private limited company, if you're a sole proprietor, if you're a partnership, you want to put your money, take any given level of risk which you want, absolutely no problem. You want to start a company, sell shares in it to the public, raise funds from the public, allow the public to come and deposit monies in your institutions and invest the monies of the general public. Now we have an entirely different kettle of fish. Now that regulatory oversight is going to be very much more important, right? So this is why the regulators have taken action to protect the best interest of clients. Clarity in describing their services to consumers. Good point that, right? When the client calls and says, I want to put my money and I want to receive 30% in the next 6 months. All I want to hear is, I mean, we experience this on a daily basis. All I want to hear is yes or no. Can you do it or not? That's all. You can do it, no problem. And then he's willing to transfer the money immediately. But we need, as financial advisors, we need to explain the risk around it. Negative earnings company, possible future growth option, but competition is high in the industry. There is points, strengths, and opportunities which the company can capitalize on, but there is a probability that you can make a loss as well. This needs to be explained to the client. As the financial advisor, if we only tell the clients 30%, 6 months, look at it, this is going to go 25%, 2 weeks, 30%, 1 year, whatever it is, you can't only talk about the return. You have to talk about the risk. You have to talk about the appropriateness of the investment to the client's status as well. Clarity in describing the services to the consumers, because there will be costs, there will be risks, there will be technicalities, etc. All of these will be part of these processes which need to be informed to the clients. Addressing the potential for advisor remuneration to distort consumer outcomes. We have to be very straightforward and clear with respect to how the advisor is going to make money as well. Because when it comes to certain investments, particularly the likes of collective investment vehicles, there will be so many unit trusts, there will be so many collective investment vehicles, etc., where you can go and put your money in. Everybody will promise 20%, 25%, 30%, whatever the returns. But for you to evaluate which fund is better than the other one, the investment strategy, the costs associated with the strategy, administrative, front-end load, back-end load, management fees, all which we have spoken about, will play a very important role in you deciding between which investment option is more appropriate for you, right? Increasing the professional standards of advisors. Thankfully, in the banking and financial sector, the professional standards are generally very high from my interactions at least. But sometimes if you take capital markets, for example, the standards of professional advisors will most likely be average, but it is most likely low. Right? You look at the individuals who are advising clients, right? I can tell you examples. There are train drivers turned stockbrokers. There are teachers turned stockbrokers. All they have to do is spend 6 months to get a part of a qualification which allows them to advise. Now, whether this is an adequate level of professional standards is a huge question mark. But that being said, of course, there are the senior brokers who are heavily qualified, heavily experienced and likewise, but there is a huge bunch out there who are not qualified to be advising clients as well, right? That's an important element also. So if you don't have the competence to advise your clients, that raises a huge question whether you can contribute from a fiduciary duty perspective. Improving the level of qualifications for the financial advice, therefore, is an important element, and undertaking appropriate continuing professional development. As bankers, I'm sure you know, as being in the capital market space, all advisors have CPD programs which they have to attend. I mean, things are changing, right? Look at the most recent past and the level of importance that digitization is playing. You take the Colombo Stock Exchange recently, they launched their app, right, mobile app, where you can trade through the confines of your mobile phone directly with the exchange, through your broker, of course. Directly with the exchange, you can trade. And within a week or two of launching the application, there was plus 17,000 CDS accounts which were created. Now, if the brokers and if the advisors are not savvy, if they are not aware of these developments, there's a major bottleneck, isn't there? You are not in a position to advise. So that was only one part of the, digitization is only one part of the continuing professional development. Many aspects which we need to be familiar with. Disclosure of material information and client reporting. Right? As we mentioned, disclosure is very important. It helps clients to identify whether, for example, there are conflicts of interest, what is the cost structures, which will help them to benchmark versus other investments. Disclosures and reporting therefore plays a very important role. Our learning objective here is to know the extent of an advisor's duty to disclose material information about a recommended investment. How much? What is the magnitude we are talking about, right? Companies must ensure they provide information about the firm and proposed investment strategy to the clients. Look at the important points there, guys. When you're studying also, please pay attention to these elements. Pick the keywords. If you look at the keywords here, about the firm and about the proposed investment strategy, that gives a huge amount of information. For example, who are the investment advisors or financial advisors that the firm possesses? What are their qualifications, competencies, experience? Could there be a conflict of interest? Are they representing any significant individual or institution, etc.? Investment strategies, from high risk to low risk to neutral to market neutral strategies to long short strategies. We've looked at the different strategies across. whether it's margin, whether it's highly leveraged, you need to be able to recognize whether the investment strategy is suitable to you or not. You take something very simple, for example, let's say you have a business, you're in the business of commodity trading. You're in the business of commodity trading, you want to put some of your retained earnings, you want to invest across in a particular fund. But the fund is also investing, a major proportion of the fund's investments is also in commodities as well. They are also in the commodity trading business. Now, again, you're seeing a bit of a mismatch. Diversification potential, not good at all. Right? How do you identify that? Investment strategy. You might be looking at a situation where you have some surplus funds, which is definitely going to be necessary in the medium term. So you would like to park that money and earn a return on it, let's say over 1 or 2 years, where you can generate a return on it, but you cannot afford to lose the capital on it. Now, do you want to go and put this surplus funds across into a high risk investment strategy? No, you only want to earn a return whilst maintaining the capital. So eventually, when it is required, you can make the respective investment. You have to look at, if you get, there's another investment, shall we say, investment mantra that we go by, fear and greed. Fear and greed, right? If you're greedy and you go after return, forgetting there is a risk element which is going to come with that. If you take our previous illustration, you went and put it into a high risk investment strategy, despite you knowing you cannot afford any capital losses because you need that investment. Risk materializes, portfolio took a hit. A year down the line, when you have to make the investment, you don't have adequate funds. Now you have to answer to the shareholders. What got you there? Greed. Great. Right. Then fear also works in a different way. When you see the potential of a particular stock, it can move from 10 to 18 rupees, but you're scared. These are behavioral biases, as we like to call it. You are scared, you're fearful that the turnaround will happen fast. By the time it hits 14, you liquidate your position and you move out. Due to that fear, you missed out on the opportunity to capitalize on another 4 rupees on the stock. So see, it's not an exhaustive list about what can happen. You need as much information as that which you can gather from your clients, from the markets and from the asset classes and what's going on, which will help you to align these to a great extent and bring in that suitability criteria, ultimately leading to you giving that comfort to the clients that you're meeting your fiduciary duty. This is what we are after. This would enable the client, therefore, to make an informed decision about see how many times are we coming across this word in this chapter, suitability of the recommendations being made. You cannot simply tell your client, this fund A, over the last 3 years has been great, therefore you need to put your money there. You need to identify whether it's appropriate, suitable to the client's requirement. Material information, what are we talking about? The information that needs to be going across can include the likes of charges, risks, penalties, warnings, special conditions like a lockout period where you can't take your money out, which can depend on products or services being offered. All of this can have a bearing on the investor. The charges, the cost, whether he can bear them or whether another fund is more appropriate for him. The risks, whether it's within his appetite. The penalties, if he wants to reverse his decisions. The warning signs, if leverage is used and if there are margin calls or whatever along the lines, any special conditions like lockouts, as I mentioned, these need to be communicated to the client so he also can recognize whether it is appropriate or not. The rationale or the basis for the investment decisions need to be produced in the materials communicated with the client so that they can assess the suitability of the investment. Again, coming down to that investment strategy. Right? What is the basis? It's a value-driven investment. It is a growth-driven investment. It is a market-neutral strategy. You need to clearly communicate this without it being jargon as well. Now, you have to be careful there as well. You will have doctors, you have lawyers. I've had many situations. I can tell you, I will not forget this. So I had to get my knee operated, right? I had a ACL reconstruction done. And when the anesthetist was trying to put me to sleep, so generally they have a talk with you, until you doze off. And he actually asked me, where do I work? I said, stockbrokering company. He actually asked me, can you tell you, I have stocks of First Capital. Can you tell me what to do with it? I'm lying spread eagle on the operating table, and this guy is asking me about what to do with First Capital. Right? Unforgettable incident in my life. Right? So essentially, coming back to the point, is there needs to be a rationale why you're making the respective investment, so that the clients also can assess the suitability of the investment to themselves. Firms managing investments for clients on behalf of clients or even individuals, right? You should establish a meaningful way of evaluating and reporting performance. Very important. See, performance evaluation can be easily manipulated. It can be easily manipulated. What is the first level and the easiest way of manipulating? Selecting the respective periods. You had a long period of lull and then a sudden period of rally, right? So if you take that long period, let's say the first 8 months was a lull, nothing much happened. Last 4 months was a rally, which you saw major benefits, right? And post that 4 months rally, also the market is going to go down to a lull again. What do? You try and overlap the periods, the lull periods, with this massive growth periods. You take, you take like trailing 12 months or some nonsensical jargon you use, and you basically overlap with that growth period, which basically might show that you have earned an average or above average return when the market is having a average or below average performance. And the investors will be like, wow, now this is a performance evaluation is going to be very important from a client's perspective as well. They can evaluate whether the performance that is actually being communicated is actually legitimate or not. Right? Reporting frequencies, evaluating the performance. You can change benchmarks. You can change the years which you're being indexed to. The Sri Lankan authorities also did that at a point of time with respect to certain indicators. I mean, very simple. Suddenly you look like you're an average performer in a market which is going down, which puts you in a good place, right? So what are we talking about here? The frequency of valuations, delegations or discretions in the level of portfolios. What are the benchmarks which are being used? Objectives, constraints, risks, etc. are going to be an important element, because those need to have been considered at the onset before you start thinking about your investment strategy as well. Because let's say we have established through an investment policy statement with the client that we are looking at a risk neutral, current income oriented investment strategy. But at the end of the day, when you're evaluating the performance, you're looking at the investment advisor has gone and put your money in high risk instruments with a capital gain oriented income strategy. And you're like wondering what happened. We wanted a risk neutral, current income, dividend, constant dividend paying investment strategy. This guy is looking at a what? High risk, capital gains oriented investment, completely out of whack, right? So the objectives, risks, and constraints play an important part of that evaluation framework as well. We identified conflicts of interest play an important role. We are trying to understand here the term conflict of interest and know the importance of transparency. This is how you address conflict of interest, through disclosure and transparency relating to direct and indirect costs of service. A conflict of interest is where someone in a fiduciary position has a personal or professional interest that competes with their duty to act in the client's best interest. For instance, let's say an IPO comes out. My company hypothetically is the manager of the IPO. And I'm going and, plastering it across my clients to buy the IPO. Now there is a conflict of interest there, right? I am representing the company that is selling the shares, that is putting the IPO out. I'm also trying to buy the shares for my customers as well. Who am I going to cater to. Because the guy who is having the IPO, he's going to want to sell off all the shares at the best possible price, which let's say is 25 rupees. Then you'll have the clients who will want to buy into the best possible price, which is best execution, meaning lowest possible price there. Now, automatically there is a conflict there. What also happens is I make a commission from the clients. I make a better commission for hypothetically from the IPO management. They will tell me if I sell 50% of the shares, I'll get 0.5% of the issue. If I sell 75% of the shares, I'll get 1% of the issue. If I sell 100% of the issue, I will get 3% of the issue. What am I going to try to do? I'm going to try to convince my clients to buy into the IPO, which may or may not be suitable to my clients. Conflict of interest. In the event, the firm earns fees or commissions, like the illustration we looked at, there is a potential for a conflict to exist between what is good for the advising firm and what is good for the firm's client. The 3% on the IPO versus the 0.64 commission that will come to the brokering house. It may not be possible to completely remove the conflict of interest, and therefore open and transparent disclosure of fees and commissions will help reduce this conflict. It is recognized that it can be difficult in certain situations to completely remove the conflict of interest out of the picture, and therefore to reduce this conflict of interest, transparent disclosures we put out there. There are benefits that the company is reaping as a result of the transaction, which you put it out to the clients as well. They may have questions on what are the safeguards that you have put in place, and you need to put in safeguards. That is going to help reduce this conflict of interest. So European investment firms are required to document conflict of interest policies, which require effective organizational and administrative arrangements designed to prevent conflicts of interest appropriately. So that would basically be documentation. Information controls and barriers to stop information about investment research activities from flowing to the rest of the firm's business. Now, you might see a situation where, for example, you might have a stockbrokering house which also has an investment banking arm. Now, the investment banking arm gets a mandate where there is a takeover involved, both listed companies. Now, this is price sensitive, non-public information. If it gets out into the market, obviously, generally what happens is the target company's share prices shoot up. If it gets out into the market, you can make good money on it, albeit unethical. Now, you have the brokers on the stockbrokering side who will earn the commission, who will be after that information. And you have the investment banking arm who has that information. You need to have the safeguards to make sure, like a firewall, to make sure that this information doesn't exchange between the investment banking arm and the stockbrokering arm. If it does, you have a conflict of interest. Where specific conflicts cannot be managed away, like for example, the firewalls, when it comes to the advisory that we just spoke about, you can use disclosures. Maintaining an effective overall policy and communicating the same will also give that transparency comfort to the clients. Maintain records of previous conflicts of interest. Very important that you maintain records, because in the event some issue does crop up, you must have the documentation to back your position, where you can show, look here, we took the necessary safeguards, we acted in the best interest of our clients, but there was a residual conflict remaining. This is how we try to manage it through the disclosures and transparency. If you can provide this information, you're not going to be in a difficult place. Inducements. A firm should not pay any fee or accept any fee, commission, or provide or receive any non-monetary benefit that could impact its fiduciary duty to clients. This could be a very real threat in the financial services sector. Your client might tell you, you generate me 30% return this year, I'll let you stay in my, holiday home in Switzerland for 2 weeks. You return 25% to me over the next 6 months, non-monetary benefits, you can expect a, decent gift. And let's say, for example, you do hit the 25% in 6 months time, in 3 days time or the next day itself, gift box is coming to you with a Rolex in it. These can impede your independence and transparency, which you need to be careful about. You cannot receive any monetary or non-monetary benefit that could impede this fiduciary duty, because you will focus on generating a return in the previous example to the respective client at the expense of all the other clients, right? Which means you would have failed in your duty to clients. Receipt or payments of such will be permissible under the following circumstances: disclosed in accordance with appropriate standards, fee or commission or the benefits paid directly by the client with a clear explanation. Payments or received from third parties are only permitted where there will be no impairment to compliance with the firm's duty to act in the client's best interest, and the amount is clearly disclosed. Now, you have to be very careful here. Simply don't take this message out from here. Simply disclosing the monetary or non-monetary benefits that you receive, just because you disclose it, it doesn't mean that there isn't a conflict of interest or that you have reduced the conflict of interest. It doesn't justify you having a conflict of interest by simply just disclosing it. That doesn't make it right. You go and rob a bank just because you go and tell everybody, hey guys, I was the one, I'll take responsibility for robbing the bank. That doesn't make the money legal, does it? Same situation. Right? So there'll be certain guidelines, there'll be certain criteria. Generally, for example, non-monetary gifts, how you would see if you went into the detail in relation to these inducements, which is not part of your syllabus, you will see they will attach specific values to it. If it goes beyond certain values, then it is considered as impairing your independence, or depending on what the request of the client is as well, then it is considered to impede your independence. Then not disclosure, only divine intervention can make it a non-conflict of interest. So don't take the message that disclosure is going to remove the responsibility of your conflict of interest. Not the case. Fiduciary responsibilities of intermediaries. Again, the banks or financial institutions also might use intermediaries in their processes, which is perfectly fine. Right? You might not have certain transactional expertise, you might not have certain strategic expertise, which will require you to use intermediaries, collaborations, or partnerships. No problem at all. But what is important to be recognized is that the fiduciary responsibilities extend beyond the financial advisors, not only the bank, but or the financial institution. It also extends to the firms and financial intermediaries that are being used as well. And this will include the likes of terms of contract, regulatory rules, legislation. All of these aspects will govern the intermediary as well, which you need to bear in mind. These sources impose controls on participants in the investment chain. Now that's the chain, right? You have the first institution, you have the intermediary, and then you have the client. You can have many collaborations, like a syndicated loan, for example. Right? That's the investment chain. How the powers are exercised: do not exceed power authorized and do not use improperly. As an intermediary, you need to be aware of that as well. Avoid conflicts and not make unauthorized profit, because if you're an intermediary, the chances that you will also be accessing material, non-public, price-sensitive information, for example, will be very high. It doesn't absolve you from the insider dealing tradings as well. You have to keep it confidential. So other participants will also owe a duty of care to the respective client. The laws may also require participants to exercise reasonable care and skill and hold professionals or those that hold themselves out as having special skills or expertise to a higher standard. Again, this comes under ethics as well. You are expected to possess the necessary level of skill, knowledge, expertise, know-how to deliver on a particular service. You create a fund which is trading in real estate investment trusts. You create a fund which trades in commodities. You create a fund that is trading in currencies, for example, whatever it might be. Do you have the competency to do so? Are you using an intermediary who has the competency to do so? If that is not the case, once again, your duties to your clients, you are putting at risk, which is not good. So large professional clients now regularly look at the ethical behaviors of financial intermediaries they also do business with as well. Because in addition to the reputational aspect, governance and ethics are now playing a very important role in the financial services industry. Right, so we covered our first section in terms of getting an understanding. I mean, there's a lot of information in there reiterating that you owe as financial advisors a fiduciary duties to your clients. You cannot benefit for yourself or your entity by putting the client at risk. Client first, duty to clients. Which brings us to advising clients. Right now, remember we touch base on acquiring information so that we can understand the status of the client, which will help us to recognize which are the investments that are suitable to the client. Right? This whole process is coming together now. Right? So as you can see, there is a few stages in this investment planning process, but it is a good process. It is a solid process. If we can get this together and if we are effective about it, even in the event the investment doesn't perform to expectation, you can still tell the client, look here, we agreed upon this. This was your level of risk. This was your level of return. These were the expectations. These were the boundary conditions. And therefore, this is the appropriate strategy. And he can't back out of it. When you don't have any of this, you tell a client wants to put ₹1 million into the market, you tell him today's stocks which are going is this one, put your monies in there, and when the stocks don't perform and the client tells you, why didn't you ask me what about my circumstance? Why didn't you ask me where my other exposures are? Now you're going to have a big issue. Right? So this investment planning process, number one, looks at collate the relevant client information. We'll speak more of this as we go along again. Ascertain needs and if relevant, individuals' goals as well. Remember on day one, we spoke about how important that risk return objectives are. You have got to establish it all at the onset. It will give you good insight. Is he talking about a high risk? Is he talking about a high expectation for return? If so, we need to be able to explain what is the appropriate strategy, and together with it, what is the level of risk that is going to come with it. Then he will be able to evaluate whether he is in a position to stomach it or not, the appetite for risk. Establish macroeconomic risk and liquidity drivers. Right, so when you look at analysis itself, when we are choosing between our analysis, we like to go to this top-down model of analysis. We start with the macro. We identify, okay, we look at the economic factors. We identify which industries stand to perform and which industries stand to not perform, underperform. Within the performing industries, we try and identify which are the counters that we want to put it. Then we look at their valuations, whether they are attractive or not. Then we make the decision whether to invest or not. Economics, industry, company, valuations. This macroeconomic, you're seeing that first level of analysis coming together. Now you're creating the basis, the rationale for making the investment. Identify any other considerations and constraints. Right? There may be a situation where a particular industry might be seen to have positive effects in the near future. But that doesn't mean all the companies in the respective industry is going to perform. That's a constraint. That is a specific criteria. Decide whether the strategy will invest into direct assets or use indirect investment products. You can get a direct exposure by, let's say, for example, let's say real estate is going to be the performing asset class in the future. You can go and have a direct investment in property by purchasing a property itself, but it has its risks. You can go and invest in a real estate investment trust, buy shares or units of the exchange itself and get the exposure. High levels of liquidity, excellent. Access to professional investment advice. You can look at alternative collective instrument vehicles even. All of these options are available, which we have discussed. Which markets, what level of regulation, which type of asset classes, whether they are collective investment instruments, all of these asset classes are now coming together. The considerations which we spoke about in the previous 4 chapters. Review the range of solutions and identify which is the most suitable to the client. Take our property example, for instance. Let's cut it down to 2 options. We are deciding between a direct investment in property and putting our money in a real estate investment trust REITs. If your client has the holding power, you advising him, holding power, let's say over 3 to 7 years or 3 to 5 years, you advising him to put his money, he doesn't have any liquidity requirements over the next 3 to 5 years. You telling him to put his money in a physical property, direct property investment is perfectly fine. He doesn't have the requirement for liquidity. He completely wants the capital gains. The respective investment strategy matters. Your investor wants to get access to property investment, exposure to property, but there is a possibility he will have a liquidity requirement over a period of time. Now you go and park the money in a physical property, where if and when that liquidity requirement materializes, you're going to have a problem. Now direct property investment is not appropriate. Now what is more appropriate? The real estate investment trust, because it brings in that major liquidity consideration into the picture as well. Now that is a lot more beneficial. See how we are bringing the status, the economics, the asset classes, and deciding between all of these elements. Now we are bringing it together. Construct a portfolio based on the investment strategy. Think about the variables which we consider, right? The information of the client. What are his goals? For his status, his goals, the external environment. We identified any constraints. We looked at alternatives and identified which is more suitable. We are reviewing the solution, and now we are constructing the investment strategy. Right? The chances, the probabilities, if we can get an effective process in play here, the probability that we can get a very effective investment strategy in place is going to be very high. Now everything will match, and as you keep improving on your expertise, experience, etc., the levels of matching, the structures, the percentage allocations, etc., you will be able to match it to a great extent. You being able to do this effectively, I mean, what do we mean by you being able to do this effectively means at the end of the day, you would have been able to meet the expectations of the client to a very high level. His level of return, what was his expectation, the different levels of risks and the metrics, what were his exposures or appetites, all of this you would have been able to meet at the end of the day to a reasonable degree if you can get an effective process in place. Present the recommendation to the client. Collect, ascertain, establish, identify, decide, review, construct, and present to the client. The investment planning process. These can get broken down into its individual phases, and the level of detail can increase. Right, we look at the different types of customers next. So classifying clients is a key aspect of financial services regulation as well. The reason being, regulation is particularly designed to give the greatest protection to those who are most vulnerable. So you bring in a high net worth individual or an ultra high net worth individual, for example, he has a greater appetite to take risks. He can stomach a greater level of volatility. But you try and apply the same aspect to an individual, he doesn't have that appetite anywhere near that high or ultra net worth individual, which is why regulation will play a much bigger role when it comes to protecting the investment of those basic generic retail investors. Clients, therefore, can be categorized into either retail, professional, or an eligible counterparty. So retail and professional are pretty straightforward. Eligible counterparty, how we recognize it, is another financial services firm, such as an investment firm or an investment insurance company or a mutual fund. Essentially, how you will distinguish between the retail and the professional also is the professional will have some level of knowledge versus the retail. The chances that might not be the case is very high. Professional client, we are talking about a financial services firm, an institutional investor or private investor who can meet certain tests. A retail client is any client who is not one of the above. So different types of clients will have an implication to the investment strategy and particularly from a risk return basis as well. A firm is required to notify a client of how they have been categorized before they undertake any services for them and of their right to be recategorized. We are telling the client, this is my understanding of you as an investor based on the information that you are giving me. Your willingness to take risk is this, your appetite to take risk is this, your culture towards risk is this, your capacity to take risk is this, your objectives and how they align, and we are going to create this persona for the investor. And we tell him, this is our image of you, this is our view of you. I mean, he's open to argue it out, but you put it down to paper. If a private client, for example, requires to be classified as a professional client, remember we spoke about certain tests when it came to professional clients, those are coming to light now. Now you have a private client. He wants to be classified as a professional client. Here we will carry out what we call an appropriateness test, which identifies, remember I told you on the skills basis, which identifies what is the client's prior experiences, skills, etc. in terms of investing. In terms of businesses and client agreements, so regulators require firms to pay due regard to information needs of the client and communicate in a manner which is clear, fair, and not misleading. So clients will have requirements, quarterly, weekly, monthly, depending on what their influence over the investments are, they will have different requirements. And organizations, we must be able to cater to that in a clear, fair manner. What can happen is we can put out these 18-page reports with graphs and charts and technical jargon and so much of numbers in there that the average client won't understand head or tail about it. That's not the way to go about it. It has to be presented in a clear and fair manner, which is understandable and not misleading as well. You will see funds. There will be certain instances, I have seen instances where certain funds, international ones particularly, the performances are dodgy, right? But they are putting it out in such a way that the information is so jumbled up and all you see is 17%, 18%, 25%, all positives. The negatives are like -3%, -2%. I mean, you can't fathom what is going on. But sometimes you look at it, hey, everything looks positive by a larger value, fund must actually be performing well here. Not necessarily the case. All information about the firm, services offered, charges, etc. must be provided to clients to make informed decisions. We touched base on this earlier as well. It helps clients to benchmark between the different investments they can make and identify which is more appropriate for them. This should be made available prior to the investment business and for appropriate clients within a reasonable period of time, even after the business as well, as and when they require, depending on their requirement and appropriateness of the same. This is generally achieved by a terms of business document. It can take the name can take different forms, of course, but here for our purposes, it's called the terms of business document, which sets out the above and must be signed off by the client, which helps us to cover our REA as well. At the end of the day, when the client comes after us telling us, look at this, this is not here, this is not there, you show him saying, sir, we showed you what our views were as per your requirements. We explained to you what are the risks there. Despite that, you wanted to go ahead with that investment, and we explained the probability of the risk materializing. It did materialize, and look at our projections, it's right on par. So you can't tell us that we didn't tell you, right? Status of advisors and status of disclosure. A firm must disclose its scope of advice before providing services and whether the recommendations will be based on independent advice, considering across the market offering, restricted advice, which is limited to a single or several service providers. The firm must disclose this information across as well, on whether the information will be based on either independent advice, are we looking across the market offerings, or are we looking at a very specific limited to a single or several service providers. Because if we are looking at selected service providers, for example, our cost can increase, which obviously is going to get passed on to the clients, which they would obviously require to be aware of. Know your customer rules. Coming from the banking industry, I'm pretty sure you don't have to be informed about this. You must be very aware of them. And there should be sufficient information obtained about customers to enable us to meet the responsibility to give suitable advice. This will include personal details, financial objectives, risk tolerances, liquidity, time tax, unique preferences, etc. All of this will come together, which is going to have a bearing on how you're going to advise your client. What are the asset classes? What percentages to put in? How much of cash to hold? What investment horizon to look at? All of these considerations are going to be part of your advice. And without knowing the details of the client, you are not going to be able to do it effectively. The purpose is to gather the information about the client that is clear so that the financial plans can be devised and appropriate recommendations made. Once you've understood these circumstances and statuses, now you're in a better position to advise the client. Right, suitability and appropriateness, important consideration. Suitability in particular, you've seen it come across many a time. But before we go into it, let's jump into our break. As usual, if you do have any questions, you guys are pretty quiet. If you do have any questions, feel free to put it up on the screen. As soon as we get back, we can start off with the questions. Hope everyone's back, and let's move along with our fiduciary relationships, and we are looking at advising clients, and we are coming to the very important topic of suitability and appropriateness. We have reiterated this point again and again as well. Now, subsequent to gathering the information, the firm must ensure recommendations are suitable depending on the requirements and the status of the client. Now, that suitability criteria, that information criteria, which we lightly touched upon initially, now we are going into the detail, right? This is the exact reason why today, if let's say in equity markets, a set of stocks are going, if a customer comes and asks you, if a client asks the investment advisor, which way am I going to put the stock, which way am I going to put my investment, you cannot simply often recommend the stocks which are going today because at this point of time, you are not aware of what is the circumstance status of the client. So whether the stocks are suitable or not, like the banking, the individual working for the bank, putting the money in the fixed deposit and investing in the banking stock, like that, similar to that illustration, same situation. We first need to stop and understand what is the status of the client. Very important aspect. Even when firms choose to offer certain products or services, it must be considered from a suitability basis. This might be relevant from your perspective, from a private banking perspective, for example. It's not where you create a product and try and mass market it, which is sometimes what does happen. We need to be able to balance it across. We need to be able to some extent at least, customize it so it fits the profile of the client. Whether it is appropriate for the client or not is a key consideration here. To assess the customer's knowledge and experience, firms should gather information on, for example, types of services and transactions the customer is familiar with. Because if he is familiar with financial markets, if he is familiar with equity markets, if he is familiar with banking transactions, if this guy is familiar with having traded with derivatives, for example, now you know his knowledge is at a bit of a different level, which you can talk about. Types and services of transactions that he is familiar with. Nature, volume, frequency, and time customer has been involved with the said transactions. I mean, you having done one transaction in a equity market does not make you a specialist. And in fact, you take the Sri Lankan stock exchange, the Colombo Stock Exchange, for example, they classify their active accounts. There are 600,000 plus, I think near 700,000 accounts which have been created, but they classify only about, I think in the region of about 20,000 accounts as active accounts. The definition of these active accounts is at least one trade per quarter. One trade per quarter. I mean, it's absolutely negligible, right? Now, if you take that active account status based on the definition, and if we try and identify that that is a client with experience, that is not a good way to be looking at the situation, isn't it? Right? So frequency, time, volume, all this will be very important to identify what is the level of his knowledge and experience. Level of education, profession, etc. He might be extremely well educated in the profession of medicine. Does that mean that he can invest in capital markets? Not exactly. He might be extremely educated in engineering, but does that mean he is qualified to invest in capital markets? Not exactly. You might be extremely educated in accounting. Does that mean that you are capable of investing in capital markets? Not entirely. Right? So these need to be evaluated to identify the level of knowledge. And whether is a potential vulnerable customer as well. Are there any vulnerabilities that you're looking at? You know, collaterals, underage, dependents, etc. All can indicate certain aspects of that. The firm is acting on a continuing basis. See, you're not going to advise him today, your client, and then forget about the guy. Some of the investment advisors do that, particularly with their smaller clients. You're not going to advise your client and forget about it. Right? Today, your client comes and tells you, this is a good example. Even, you know, I was talking to someone. So this individual came, small time, you know, he wanted to invest in the stock market. He opened an account and put in 600,000 rupees to trade with the stock exchange. Now the broker was all excited, 600,000 rupees, etc. Straight up, you know, from the word go, made the respective transactions, got his commissions. That was it. Now the client which I introduced is constantly calling me and saying, broker is not responding, no research report. I'm asking queries, he is not responding. Broker got his commission, done and dusted, forgotten. This is not how you should take things forward. You have to look at it on a long-term perspective, particularly when you look at wealth management. Investment management, as I mentioned, we are looking at, for example, an equity portfolio you're managing. Wealth management is the overall wealth of the individual or institution, for example. You need to take a much longer broader comprehensive view of what's going to happen. Right? So the firm is acting on a continuous basis and must make sure that the suitability is maintained throughout. Why does this throughout factor play an important role? Is because the client's circumstances, the external circumstances are only rarely static. If you take a modern business context, it's almost never static. So whether it's the client, he moves on to a new job and he's earning a much higher salary and his level of savings is great. Suddenly he gets married and he has quadruplets. Right? His circumstances change now. He comes into a huge inheritance, whatever it is. Capital markets takes a massive hit as a result of the pandemic. Whatever it might be, the circumstances are going to change, which is going to have an implication to the suitability of the client's portfolios. Now you need to rebalance the portfolios to align the suitability back to the suitability criteria again, right? So it's not a one-off procedure. It's a continuing aspect that you need to be carrying out as well. General best practice is to provide a report to the client about the investment, its rationality, its continuing suitability, etc. It will act as a good control mechanism and feedback mechanism even for the advisor as well. What is included in the suitability report? If a firm provides investment advice, it must provide a retail client with a report specifying how the advice or recommendation is suitable to meet their needs. This is where you give that comfort to the client, saying, based on our understanding of who you are, this is our view of the suitability of the respective investment. Regulators will expect evidence that demonstrates a firm acted, now again that important point is coming to light, in the best interest of the client and has met its suitability obligation. Because if the client goes to town, we've had portfolios, portfolio was worth 100 million, portfolios as 50 million, and suddenly it's only worth 1 million or 11 million. The clients are obviously going to go to courts or, take regulatory action, legal action. Then you need to have the relevant documentation, the relevant records. For example, when a client over the phone calls and tells the broker to execute a particular transaction, it is recorded and it is processed and it is saved. Right? It is part of a key records, right? This needs to be maintained in the event there is a requirement to illustrate your processes, your action to maintain that best interest of clients. If you have to at any given point prove it, these are going to be very important elements which you will have to go to. So when you come to advising clients, you can also have this interesting transaction or service which is called execution only sales. Here, there is no advice provided to the client. The firm is only undertaking execution. For example, in equity markets, the investment advisor might be advising the client to purchase a set of stocks. This is not execution only sales. This is advising the client. I am telling the client to invest in the respective stock. Execution only sales is the client is calling the advisor, or through internet banking, for example, online trading, the client is executing the sales, right? Or the client is putting the sale. Execution, the broker has to execute it. Did the broker advise the client to make the investment? No. Client is telling the advisor, I want to buy 100,000 shares of John Keel's holding. Do it. That's it. No advice is provided to him. Execution only sales. Therefore, on the part of the firm, there is no suitability criteria which is considered, because it's the client who wants it, right? We are not advising. Now, we are not bound by it. In this case, therefore, the previous fact-finding exercises like the customer details are basically irrelevant. Customer wanted to make it. Ideally, as a advisor, if you can, not that you're bound to do so, but on a practical basis, in the event he's taking an excessive risk, he's doing something undue, or even if he's making a good investment, it's good to just put your view out there without liability, of course, to make sure that the client is kind of aware of what is going on. Charges and commissions as part of the fiduciary relationships. We saw in the previous section how charges and commissions can play an important role, particularly in determining between investing in different types of funds. Right? And we know when it comes to financial institutions, reading between the lines, the fine print, the hidden charges, all of these can be very key aspects, right? Customers should be made aware of the costs so that they are able to make informed choices. Because look, at the end of the day, if they are looking at two funds, both are giving the same level of return and the same level of risk profile, the decision comes down to, okay, what is the cost of the respective funds? Now, if all of this is mixed up and jargon and technically put out there, the customer can't decide between the two funds. That should not happen. It has to be clearly and concisely communicated to the client. These are our charges. And if one fund is going to be charging 7% and the other one is only going to be charging 5%, the client already has his decision about where he wants to put his money, right? The other day, I was looking at this international market on the real estate aspect of it. And when you actually, you do the whole mortgage calculations, etc. It was to do with real estate. So you do your whole Excel calculations and you think you have got it. Just to reconfirm though, something which I did is, I went to one of the banks there, and I identified a mortgage calculator which they have, and then I subjected the respective information, and everything was like haywire, right? My numbers were off by about 20-25%, which was shocking. So then I go into it and identify all these hidden charges, land tax, transfer tax, insurance. If over a particular value you're looking at a mortgage, you don't have insurance. Under a particular value, if you're putting less than 20% equity, you're going to have to take insurance. If it's more than 20%, no. The entire aspect of it completely changed based on the charges and information across over there. That needs to be communicated to the client, right? So I was talking to a pal of mine from Australia, and he was saying he was shopping for a loan recently, and he says, these guys talk about an interest rate, but ultimately when you start paying and you start realizing all of these hidden charges, he actually mentioned to me, I forget the word, there is a particular way they define, like an all-inclusive interest rate sort of. What exactly is that value? That's the number they are after. And sometimes the difference is between 1% and 4%, which the institution is talking about, which is a huge difference, right? It's a huge difference. So this information must be made aware to the clients for them to make informed decisions. This should be done in writing and before any business is conducted. You cannot, after the customer has signed off on the document, then you cannot tell him, look here, these are the other numbers coming in there, or addendums and appendices are coming later on, which is something entirely different. Product related costs and commissions must also be disclosed. Basically, every single aspect in relation to that charges and commissions. For package products, the details should be included in what we call a key features document, KFD. For mutual funds, this is known as a key investor information document. Right? So whether it's collective instruments or package products, etc., a much more comprehensive, detailed document is available in relation to all the features, charges, and the commissions. Bottom line, ultimately, all information should be made available in a concise manner, in a transparent manner, for the client to make his informed decision on whether to invest in the respective instrument or not. A cooling off and cancellations. In certain circumstances, customers who are entering an investment arrangement are entitled to a period of reflection during which they can decide whether or not to proceed with their purchase. I'm not aware of whether any of our financial services offer that. It was a new structure to me as well. If this option is provided, the firm must give a clear, prominent notice in writing either before or, if not possible, immediately after the sale, right? Whether it is available or not. The firm must inform the client with regard to existence of the right to cancel or withdraw, the duration, the conditions, and other practical details, such as you might have penalties, there might be lockout periods, how the funds get transferred, how long do they need to transfer the money, etc. All of this needs to get communicated, because at the end of the day, if it's a feature that benefits the client, where after, let's say, for example, between 3 to 6 months, if he doesn't like the instrument, he can revert to his initial position. It's a benefit to the client, right? It's like a put option. That needs to get communicated, right? Because obviously, if he doesn't know about it, he cannot exercise it, and he doesn't know that, right? Product disclosures. Packaged products are attractive to retail customers, and regulators require certain features to be highlighted in the key features document, which we touched based on in the previous slide. This is intended to optimize the ability of the customer to make comparisons, to benchmark between different packaged products. Because if you look at the packaged products, everything is coming together. A fund, for example, a collective instrument vehicle, for example, since they are coming together, it's difficult to try and identify which one is more appropriate. But if the features are going to be highlighted, now comparison is made a little less difficult as a result of the information that is made available. Key investor information document as it applies to the mutual funds. What are we talking about? The location of details pertaining to yields, buying prices, selling prices, whether the certificates issued, where they will be sent, names, addresses, ACD, authorized corporate director, depositories, etc. All of these are going to be included across in this key investor information document as it applies to the mutual funds. Again, a heads up, guys, remember, from an exam perspective, we are trying to keep things practical, but ultimately we have to focus on the exam. Considering the exam is MCQs and objective questions of the sort, they can ask you even questions from very concentrated areas, like in a mutual fund key investor information document, what are the type of informations you might see, or what is not the type of information you might see, right? So you will have to be familiar with these nitty-gritties, the nooks and crannies as well. Right, so we've looked at advising the clients, and now we specifically focus on an area in terms of determining the client's needs, because this has to happen at the onset before us trying to structure our investment strategies. If we haven't recognized the risk return objectives of the clients, your investment strategy is not going to be effective. It's not meeting any criteria, right? So determining clients' needs at the onset is very important. Understanding the key stages in the investment planning and determining the investment objectives and strategies, what we are after here. We look at the financial planning process here, where we look at an introduction or description to the service. This is where we start with disclosure in terms of what is the product that we are trying to offer to the client, or the services that we have to offer to the client. We then determine the client's requirements. We formulate a strategy based on the client's respective requirement. We assess his existing assets and potential solutions are established. We produce a recommendation and a final plan, which he will ideally sign off on. We will continuously revisit the investment, the objectives, as well as the strategy, because objectives of the individual can change, which will require changes to the investment strategy as well, right? Which we need to constantly be aware of as well. And it is an ongoing process which we need to be aware of. The main responsibilities of the advisor, therefore, when we look at this process, we can identify as help the clients decide on goals and prioritize objectives. Because look, sometimes, remember we spoke about the willingness and the capacity to take risk. The willingness to take risk is a bit subjective. You know, I'm a risk taker. I want to take risk. But your ability, what is your current portfolio size? Do you have assets to back you? Have you got assets to pledge as collateral? No. Willingness to take risk is high, capacity to take risk is low. We need to introduce the clients to these processes, formal processes, so that they can understand and that they also can align with the process. Right? And it will help streamline the objectives as well, because they tell us, I want a 30% return. So we explain, okay, you want a 30% return. This is the associated risk with it. Are you willing to accept that risk? Do you have the capacity to accept that risk? Now suddenly he's thinking, huge volatility in the portfolio, potential to lose my capital as well. I'm 55 years old. No, that's not going to work for me. I need something like this. You know, I want current income. I don't want any risk to my existing capital. Now that 30%, okay, based on that risk objective, now the return is going to come down to about 15%. Is that in line? Now he's thinking, okay, I wanted to travel every quarter, not going to happen. I'll travel once a year. Now you're finding the give and take and aligning all of these capacities, appetites, willingness with the risk return objectives. This is what we are after. Document the client's investment objectives and risk tolerance and get him to sign off. Communicate it to him. This is our view of what your tolerances, objectives, etc. are like. Do you agree? Yes or no? Because later on, when he comes after you for whatever reason, hopefully there won't be a reason, then you can show this document based on the information you provided. You wanted 30%. Against our advice, you decided to take the risk. The risk materialized. Now you don't have the capacity to hold on to it, but this is exactly what we advised you. Despite that, you wanted to go ahead, which is what you have signed off on. Determine and agree an appropriate investment strategy. Ideally, we would have explained to him the capacities, willingness, appetite, etc. Establish the investment objectives and risk tolerance based on the same. And then we, as the investment advisor, would have structured an investment strategy and we would have recommended it to him to sign off. Very important, continuously. Fiduciary relationships, meaning the client's best interest is going to be absolute priority. They are agreed, keep the products under review depending on the frequencies, etc. Otherwise, generally, you will probably have an annual or biannual review. Carry out necessary administration and accounting in terms of keeping the respective elements up to date. Determining the client's needs, ultimately leading to establishing these objectives and the needs of the client. How do you get there is by sourcing the right information, right? And what is this information that we are after? Advisors must know the customer before providing appropriate advice. I mean, today I have been harping on about this like a broken record: suitability, appropriateness, client information, etc., etc. Same things again and again I have been going on about it. You're seeing the importance of this fiduciary relationships across, right? Some of this key information will include establishing a rapport, communicate with the client, establish the purpose of the meeting, explain the information collection procedure, using open closed-ended questions to establish information needed, checking the level of understanding. Now, this is where, you know, suddenly your financial advisor comes across and he wants to know how much you are earning, how many people in your family, what are their ages, are there any other dependents, do you have life insurance, blah, blah, blah. You feel very, you know, violated kind of. Why is he asking all of this private information? I'm giving you 100,000 rupees, I'm giving you ₹1,000,000. All I want is for you to invest it. Why are you asking me all these questions? Right? But we need to first communicate. This is the information we need. This is why we need it, because we can really align it, understand your capacities, appetite, willingness, etc. And we can get at the best possible investment strategy to fit your requirements. Communicate this. Now he will be a little more open to you. I mean, the chances, particularly from a local context, the chances that they will still hide some of that information is very high. But nevertheless, we need to have some starting point, right? Collecting details. This will involve a detailed, lengthy interview with the client. You know, it's like a third degree. Like in the movies, you put the guy behind a one-way mirror and you have him questioned. It's something like that. No, no, no. You invite the guy over. You have cashews, biscuit, drinks, etc., and you grill him for the next 2 hours. Interview with the client to understand the existing assets and liabilities and to develop an understanding of what their needs are. Not only assets, if there are corresponding liabilities, there are constraints there as well. You need to establish all of these variables before you can arrive at what the objective are. Details, of course, will extend to the likes of personal detail. Health status can be an important aspect. If you look at a modern context, non-communicable diseases are at a very high stage, from the likes of diabetes or cancer or whatever, coronary issues, etc. If you have any health related issues, which can have, for example, a liquidity bearing on your portfolios, that is also going to have an implication to your investment strategy, right? Details of dependence. If it's only you and your spouse, for example, your investment strategy is going to be different. If it's only you, you're a single individual, your investment strategy is going to be different. You're a family of 5, your investment strategy is going to be different. You're a family of 5, but all your kids have finished high school and are working, investment strategy is different. You're a family of 5 and all 3 of your kids are like just starting, they are just in the early stages of school, investment strategy is different, because your tenor, the liquidity requirement, etc., is all going to be different. Occupation, earnings, other income feels very personal information, but these are necessary to arrive at that specific advice that we are after. Present and anticipated outgoings in terms of any liabilities or any other expenses, pension arrangements, which can play an important role, any inheritance which you have, which you might be expecting, etc., can have a bearing. All, I mean, this is not an exhaustive list, as you probably saw, quite wide spanning in terms of establishing what is the status of the client. Once we've got the details in play, now we come to establishing the investment objectives and the strategies. Here, what we are after is to understand how to assess the client's risk tolerance, capacity for loss, investment experience, and the impact of these factors on the selection of suitable investments. We know we have to meet the client, establish the rapport, get the information, and we need to use this information to establish the investment objectives and the eventually the strategies. Right now, you're seeing that entire process coming together. Subsequent to information gathering, the advisor can then establish the investment objectives and the risk profile of the client. See how important this is, right? Based on that previous slide, the discussion which we had, creating that persona for the client is very important. If not, you're just loading him with a service or a good or service, which you're hoping that it is going to be suitable. And considering financial markets, that's a very low probability, right? You're taking a massive chance. It's just a gamble. Objectives. Generally classified into 3 fundamental: safety, income, growth. Generally. Safety, like, maintain your standard of living. Income on a current income basis, meaning there is a continuous liquidity requirement. Growth, there won't be any intermediary requirement for liquidity, but in the longer term, they'll want to see a higher capital appreciation. This can be some or a mix of any of these objectives, which you need to be ready for, right? Because if he says, I want 40% of my portfolio generating current income, the remainder, I don't mind you investing in a long-term basis. Now, 40% of the portfolio is going to be income-oriented. 60% of the portfolio, you're going to look at growth-oriented investing, right? We'll look at it as we go along. it is possible, as I just mentioned, for an investor to have more than one of these objectives. But one must not be at the expense of the other, and careful consideration must be made. When the investor has ongoing liquidity requirements and he is telling you nevertheless to invest in a growth portfolio, this is a conflicting objective, right? Where is he going to find the money from? There is no long term, there isn't a sustainability aspect to that portfolio, right? Eventually, when he can't meet the outflows, he's going to liquidate from his portfolios, which is going to cause a distress for the fund manager, right? The information gathering would have helped to paint a picture of the client's needs along the directions of maximizing growth, protecting the value of the capital, generating essential level of income, protecting against future income, etc. So when we talk to the client and we, for example, identify he does have a liability for the next 7 years, which he has to pay off, and on a monthly basis, he has 55,000 rupees going out. And he is expecting the portfolio to meet that requirement. That is telling you what is his liquidity requirement. Your client will tell you, I'm going to park my money in there and I'm going to forget about it. I mean, we have come across clients like this. Fathers, grandfathers have invested and the portfolios have come down through generations, through inheritance, absolutely no trades, right? But the capital appreciation is massive sometimes, right? So you will have clients, for example, who might tell you, I want to park my money in there and I want to forget about it. It's my rainy day fund, right? They don't have any liquidity requirement. Holding power is very high. They don't have any withdrawals out of it, but nothing is coming into the portfolio either. You can look at long-term investment portfolios in terms of asset classes or security selection even. No problem at all. Where are you going to get all of this information from is by that interaction initially at the onset with the clients. Very, very critical. So whether it's growth, whether it's to maintain the capital value, whether it's generating a particular level of income, protecting against future income, etc. Let's say, for example, you might have a situation when we come to lifetime financial planning, we'll look at it. Your client might tell you every month, tell me a value every month, which I have to park in my account. But my objective is what? In another 30 years, when I retire, I want to have an income of 250,000 rupees a month. That's my objective. Tell me now, from now on a monthly basis, what do I need to save to do that? Now you will work yourself backwards. What's the annuity required in 30 years for you to generate that 250,000 rupees a month? You work that back across into present value terms, today's terms. And what is it going to be on a monthly basis? What is the expected contribution to the portfolio required? This process needs to happen, and that is going to be effective only if you gather that information at the onset. The advisor should be able to convert this to an understandable investment objective. And we'll use classifications such as income growth or outright growth. We'll see about those objectives as well. We should be able to do this. We have to be able to convert these numbers into, for example, on an after-tax basis, on a year-on-year element, we will generate 12% return to meet your investment objective over the next 5 years, for example. These details need to get filtered across into this investment objective. A typical definition of an investment objective, for example, can be the likes of income. Seeking a higher level of current income, meaning regularly, probably, for example, in the form of dividends or in the form of interest on a quarterly basis, for example. Current income at the expense of potential future growth. See, there is a trade-off between current income and growth, right? You look at a company, for example. If a company is going to be declaring dividends from most of their profits, they don't have money to reinvest back in the business, right? They have to borrow at a higher cost, right? Cost of debt is generally higher than the cost of cost of equity is generally higher than the cost of debt, right? And they'll have to borrow. Now, what makes sense is that if they can reinvest it back in the business, if they can reinvest a greater proportion back in their business, then because the business will grow, capital appreciation will come. But out of your funds, if you're going to pay out a greater proportion of dividends, you don't have retained earnings to grow your business. Right? So there is a bit of a trade-off as well. So seeking higher level of current income, even from an individual's perspective, at the expense of potential future growth. Either, let's look at the flip side, either you can ask to reinvest your dividends back into the portfolio, which will generate compound income in the future as well, but no liquidity for you. Or you can invest in growth companies where you don't have current income because they are reinvesting their profits back into the business, but ultimately in the long run you'll have capital appreciation. So if you choose current income, it could be at the expense of potential future growth. Investment objective can be both income and growth. It doesn't necessarily have to be one or the other. It can be both either. Your investment objective can be income and growth. Requirement for a certain amount of current income, but also wants to invest to achieve potential future growth in income and capital asset. Now you have to balance the portfolio. If he says he wants a balance of current income and capital growth, 50% in dividend paying or regular interest paying securities versus growth stocks, another 50% invested in balance. If he says, I want a smaller proportion of current income and a greater proportion of capital growth, 25% hypothetically, for example, in dividend paying stocks, high dividend yielding stocks, 75% in growth stocks. Now see how you are managing your asset classes, security selection, etc. to meet the objectives of the clients. And of course, the other extreme, completely a growth oriented objective where he's not seeking any level of income, current income, but the primary objective is what? Capital appreciation. They don't have any liquidity requirements. They have the holding power. But what they are looking at is over the long term, they want their portfolio to grow to a particular level. These can be some of the investment objectives which can be established, right? And these we will, as we go along, we will interpret the different strategies based on the investment objectives and the status of the clients. You can have an outright growth strategy as well, where the investor is seeking maximum return through a broad range of investment strategies, which generally involve a high level of risk, which can, for example, include the likes of speculative asset classes or securities. It can include the likes of using leverage, for instance, to increase the magnitude of the investment, etc. All of these are the outright growth strategies as well, but at the same time, your risk is going to grow, right? We will bring all of these together as well as we go along, right? Prioritization process is what we look at next, right? Now, affordability will be a major constraint on a client's ability to protect against all of the risks that might arise from the investment decision. Can the investor stomach the risks? The advisor, therefore, needs to guide the client through this planning and prioritizing the process. For example, do you have the holding power to look at a growth strategy or to look at a growth objective? Or since you have an ongoing liquidity requirement, we need to advise that an income oriented objective is more appropriate to you. This advisor has to play this role. This will involve areas that need to be dealt with, the likelihood and the consequence of the risk, reviewing existing arrangements such as the liquidity requirements, cost of providing the protection, which is insurance we see later on, scope of the protection that the client can afford. We talk a lot about the protection instruments or insurance when we move into our last chapter, which is later on in the program. Once the client's investment objectives are agreed, now you've gathered the information, you have had a chat, you have had a back and forth, and now you have established, okay, what is your view of the client's culture, appetite, willingness, capacities, etc. You've signed off on an investment policy statement, or at least you've developed it and you've had the preliminary drafts going across, at least on a practical basis. And then you have established the investment objectives based on these risk return objectives and constraints. Very important process as part of the wealth or investment management process. Once the objectives have been agreed, now the protection levels have been covered. We talk about protection later as mentioned. Then the advisor should look at developing the investment strategy itself. This would involve risk tolerance, capacity for loss, investment preferences, liquidity, time, and tax. Again, we spoke about this in day one. I took you through the risk return objectives, which is over there: liquidity, legal, unique circumstances, taxes, time. These are going to be part of the objectives. Now you need to establish the respective requirements. Right. So I think it's a good place to call it a day. Actually, we are entering some very critical investment policy or investment management related preliminaries, because when we look at the details, when we look at the objectives, and when we look at the strategies, before we come to the strategies, this detail leading to the objectives, leading to the strategies are very important process of our investment management journey, right? So we've spoken about some of the preliminaries in terms of the details, objectives, as well as the tolerance, capacity, willingness. We have had many discussions on it as well. You will see it coming across in a more formal basis, but it's a good place to leave it and just let all of this simmer in the mind about how all of this is coming together. We'll start the discussions on the risk tolerance, capacities, as well as the investment strategies in our next class. Any questions, guys, before we call it a day? Again, I hope everything's all right and you guys are having the comprehension is adequate. There's a lot of content to go through, so there is limited amount of I mean, I can take you through case studies and examples and illustrations, but given the time constraints because of the content, I'm just trying to manage that. So hopefully all is good. Would love to see any questions coming through just to make sure that everything is sitting well. But if you do have any specific questions at any given time, do feel free to reach out. So I shall catch up with you guys next week. Until then, do take care.
Thank you.
You're welcome, guys.
Thank you.